welcome to my channel. So today I'm going to be doing a book review for a book that I recently finished and that I absolutely fell in love with, and that is Girl One by Sarah Flannery Murphy. This is basically a kind of speculative fiction book. It has bits of like sci-fi, fantasy, mystery, thriller, women's fiction. It's a bunch of everything, and I just absolutely love this book and wanted to talk about it. So basically in this book we are following Josephine Morrow, who is Girl One, and she as a child, or actually before she was a child, was a part of this experiment, this reproductive experiment, where the scientist was able to produce life with only a female's DNA. And so our main character, Josephine, is the first child of this experiment. So she and 8 other children and mother pairings were a part of this experiment. And so there's Girl 1 to Girl 9, and they all used to live on this thing called the homestead in this like countryside in Vermont. But due to like the nature of this experiment, it was not really like people, like society didn't necessarily like what was going on. You know, people like, there's religious groups, there's people who are very against these women and kind of who they are. All these different factors involved in kind of her childhood. She spends the first 6 years of her life on the homestead with you know, the other girls and their mothers, as well as this scientist who kind of created this possibility for all of them, Dr. Ballinger. And then that is the first 6 years of her life. But then we find out that there was this fire, and right before this fire things were kind of falling apart, so a lot of the mother-daughter pairings kind of left the homestead to try to start their own lives in parts of America. But there's this fire that takes place, and in this fire Dr. Ballinger and Girl 9, so the youngest girl from these experiments, were killed. And so after this fire, the remaining, I think there were 2 mother-daughter pairings still at the homestead, they decide to leave, and basically all of these these groups are spread across America and don't really talk to each other, are trying to live their own lives and kind of move past this pretty tragic event. So in our current day in the book, it's now been 17 years later, and so Girl One is kind of estranged from her mother. She left her home to go to university and to join med school because she wants to kind of follow in the footsteps of the scientist Dr. Ballinger, who she kind of saw as this father figure. And so she hasn't really talked to her mother for a year and is just doing her own thing, going to med school, all of that. But she finds out that there was a fire at her home and her mother is now gone missing. And so she decides to come back home and kind of tries to see you know, what happened to her mother and if she can find her. And while figuring out what happened to her, she ends up deciding that she needs to go and meet all of the other mother and girls from the experiment, because her mother apparently was talking to them again, even though for Girl One's whole life, Josephine's whole life, her mother has been really quiet and secretive of what actually happened at the homestead. But she finds out that her mother was actually in contact with some of these women, and so she decides that she's going to go and kind of follow along these clues and try to see what her mother was up to, and maybe if that'll help her figure out where her mother is now. And so basically we follow Josephine on this road trip as she goes across America trying to find these mothers and girls, and she ends up with a bit of a group that is helping her out and on this road trip with her. And yeah, that's basically the basic premise of the story. So there's a lot going on in the story, and I think that's what made it so much fun to read. And again, like I said, there's so many kind of different genres in this book, so like the pace of it feels very much like a thriller, because honestly, like I was at the edge of my seat trying to be like, where is her mother, what's going on, like all these different factors because people were after them, things like that. But then at the same time you have this kind of sci-fi element with like this reproductive experiment, and not only that, but we later on find out that these girls who were created through this experiment actually might have these like powers. They have these kind of extra abilities that felt really superhero-y, and so that was really cool. So there's like a bit of like this magical fantasy element, and then obviously when we have girls being born just from a female's DNA, there's a lot of like discussion about kind of like agency over women's bodies and feminism and things like that. So I don't know, I kind of grouped this into like women's fiction as well. So yeah, there's so much going on, so many great parts of this book, and I'm gonna try to break it down a little and tell you what I loved about it. So right off the bat, I got a lot of different vibes from this book. Basically, I think the book itself is said to be a bit of a Orphan Black situation, and that I think is definitely very true. Orphan Black is a great show if you haven't watched it, but it's basically about clones. And so in this book we have, like I said, we have these women who gave birth to daughters who are 100% their DNA. And so in a way, they're really just clones of themselves. And so we see throughout the book how all of these daughters are just like completely look alike their mothers. That kind of brings in different questions about like nature versus nurture, and how, you know, despite being 100% of their mother's DNA, these daughters like do have their own personalities and their own desires and things like that. But also in terms of Orphan Black, if you've watched that show, you kind of know that like it has a very kind of like this like thriller mystery feel, because, you know, we have the main character trying to find all of her clone sisters, and there are like these outside forces involved, and so that very much felt like what this book had going on. I also think that this book really reminded me of kind of Stranger Things in just a kind of specific way. We basically 11, and again, if you've watched Stranger Things, you know 11 is this child who is basically against her will taken and had like experiments done on her, which is kind of how she gets her abilities. Like she also has, I think she has like mind control or like some kind of powers. So like I said, in this book, all of these girls end up having these special powers, and kind of it's because of these experiments that were like done to them, except I mean they weren't really done to them, they were like done to create them. But either way, like I definitely got that feel. Another thing about this book is that these experiments in the book are taking place in the 1970s, and that's when all of these girls are born. And then when we get to like 17 years later, it's actually still the 1990s. And so it definitely has that kind of like old school feel that I also get from Stranger Things. I know that takes place in the 80s, but yeah, that just felt really similar, and I love both of those shows, so I thought those were really cool. And then like while reading this book, it just really reminded me of those, and if you like either of the shows, you're definitely gonna like this book. And then also, like I've said, I think the main thing that made this book really cool was obviously, you know, we have like superpowers and these experiments and this like science fiction fantasy situation going on. But I think what really pushed the story was the kind of mystery thriller element. I just think like right off the bat, we are following Josie as she's trying to find her mother and figure out what happened to her mother. And so, you know, it really is pushing the plot in a way that made you like really engage with the story and also wanting to know like what is happening. And then throughout this kind of journey, especially when we get to like the road trip and following Josie as she's meeting all these new people, you're also getting like pieces of her kind of origin story and the origin story of all of these girls and these experiments and what was going on and how they came to be. And so I just think it was a really cool way to kind of push the narrative, but also have that emotional character driven side of things. So yeah, I really like that. And another thing I really liked was the pace of this book. So I have seen some reviews saying that this book was maybe a little slow, and I just did not feel that at all. I think this book was perfectly paced, because again, we start off with a kind of really mysterious situation. There's been this fire at Josie's home, and then she goes there and she realizes that her mother's missing, and there's all of these things that kind of seem out of place. So then she's like, okay, I need to go find out what happened. So she kind of follows her mother's trail to see what her mother was up to and if that could lead to, you know, what actually happened to her mother. And so like right off the bat, I feel like it kind of is slow in the sense that like we have to set up what actually happened, and we have to find out this backstory a little. And there's also like all of these character and relationship dynamics that need to kind of be teased out so that we can see why Josie and her mother were in this position and why they weren't talking to each other and things like that. But I think especially once we get to the road trip, things just pick up in such a fun way, and just the pacing of that, like having, like I said, having this mystery be kind of the focal point of why everything is happening just really allowed the action and the emotional things and the kind of plot twists and reveals to really make sense in terms of where they were in the book, and to make sure, like, at least for me, I was never bored reading this. I always wanted to know like what was going to happen next, and you know, what were the answers we were getting. And again, like kind of because it was like a bit of like, we would get like little clues and little Easter eggs as Josie would get them, and so you can kind of like follow along with her and be like, oh, okay, like we found this thing out and that means this, and kind of connect things back. So I just really like that as well. So now I'm going to go a little more in depth, starting off with the writing. So I think the writing in this book was really kind of clear and concise in terms of like the plot itself, because I think with so much that was going on, it would have been really easy to kind of get lost in maybe the science or the plot itself. But I think that the way Murphy wrote this book she made sure that you were with her in terms of like what was going on, and the science stuff never felt like too overwhelming or taking over the story, and like neither did the kind of mystery aspects. And especially like as we are following Josie along, she is finding out all these clues and things. So I think all of it made sense, especially with the way that the book is written. You know, you weren't ever confused and you weren't ever questioning things, and it just kind of made sense. I will say less about the writing, but the actual science. I am no med student or scientist, but I have taken some science courses, and definitely some things I myself was like, yeah, that is definitely not plausible in real life. And even in terms of like these experiments that are happening on these people, that would never fly in real life, because you know these are like human trials, a very like experimental situation. And so it would have been really unethical to be like, yeah, we're gonna do this on these humans without ever having, you know, success with like animals or whatever like they have to go through before. So something like that definitely wouldn't have ever been possible. But in terms of the actual like science behind how this happened, I don't think like Murphy ever went into detail of like how this was actually possible. So I do appreciate that, because I feel like if she was like, yeah, this is the actual science and this is how like the DNA works and how reproduction works and things like that, you know, you would be able to pick that apart and be like, nah, that can't actually happen. And I feel like for me at least, that might have taken me out of the story. But I feel like because she didn't do that and she didn't like try to over explain what was going on, it made sense. And then another, like, because of that, I feel like this also really did remind me of like a superhero story where you have like all of this science behind how, you know, this person gets their powers. Like, I don't know, the Flash, for example. There are definitely those like really science-y physics, chemistry situations that they try to explain to you. And for those things, like that goes totally over my head, and I'm like, yeah, okay, you're saying it makes sense, it must happen. But again, like in this book, she doesn't try to do that, and I think that helped make sure that this book didn't get bogged down by the scientific details that it could have been bogged down by had she included it all. So I think that was actually a positive. And then lastly about the writing, so I do think that while it was very like clear and concise and easy to read, it was also really like in moments there was really beautiful writing and beautiful moments of like character development and growth and emotions and things like that. So I think this book was really balanced well in terms of having, you know, clear plot, clear action writing, but then also having those really emotional scenes and moments that really came through with the writing. So now moving to the characters, I would say we have about 4 main characters, but there's a lot of like people we meet along the way, but I'll only talk about the 4. So our main character, Josephine Morrow, who, like I've said, is girl 1. She's the one who started it all, and she is basically our narrator throughout. We are like, this book is written in first person through Josephine's perspective, and so the whole time we are basically seeing, you know, what Josephine is seeing and what she's finding out and discovering and what she's discovering about herself. And I think in terms of like, obviously when you have a main character who's basically carrying the book, it is easily possible to kind of get annoyed by her or like get annoyed by the main character, or, you know, not really connect with her, and that can again take you out of the book. But I think Josie was like a really easy character to like, and because we're seeing everything from her perspective, and she kind of is in the blue about her own past and her own origin, because her mother never really told her, and she was only 6 when she had to leave the homestead. So she doesn't really know a lot about herself, and I think that helped as a reader. Like when she was learning things, we were also learning things with her. So it wasn't like, you know, she knew something we didn't and then she had to explain it to the audience. Like she was finding something out that was important for the plot and important for like the story to move forward. So it never really felt like over explanations and exposition and things like that. So I did like that. And then I also think Josie was like a really interesting character, because like I briefly mentioned, so Dr. Ballinger, the scientist who kind of created all of this, he was with all of these girls and the mothers at the homestead for, again, those 6 years before there was a fire. And so we really see that Josie being the oldest and kind of being like the first girl that was a success story. Not only does Dr. Ballinger have this like maybe like over affection for her because she was the first girl, but she also very much sees him as this father figure. And because of her kind of estranged and difficult relationship with her mother, we really see that like she kind of puts him up on this pedestal. And because he died and like she doesn't really know him, all she knows of him is like her memories. And she's just in awe of not only like him as a person, but like his scientific discovery, and how she really sees him as the one who was the creator of her, basically. And so she again like puts him on this pedestal and looks up to him. And the reason that she wants to go to med school and kind of follow in his footsteps is because she wants to make him proud. And she, like, you know, any daughter with their parents, she's like, you know, she's kind of doing this for him to make him proud and to make sure the world sees his research and appreciates him. But like, because of that, she also comes off as a little kind of arrogant, and she just is like that, you know, I am the one who's going to finish what he started. And I think that really made for her being a really complex character, because again, like, she has this love and affection for this man who died, who she sees as her father. So now she's like, I need to make him proud and I need to carry out what he couldn't. And this just all kind of gets to her head in a way. But I just think it was done in a really good way. And then, like I said, her relationship with her mother is also very rocky at the start. And I think this book did a really good job of showing these kind of complex mother-daughter relationships. Because I think it's true as a daughter that I think like mothers and daughters especially have this very interesting dynamic. And I think a lot of mother and daughters have this, where, you know, a lot of children look up to their parents, right? And then a lot of daughters, especially, you know, when you're a teenager, you were like, I want to be nothing like my mother and I want to be completely different. I want to be my own person, and you're trying to figure out who you are. But then as you get older, you kind of, you start to appreciate your mothers more, and you start to understand and, you know, not only see like, oh yeah, like all the sacrifices they've done for you and all of that, but just see how much nurturing and caring and the brunt of parenthood falls on your mother. And so I think that this book did a really great job of showing that through Josie and her mother's relationship, because we see Josie, especially at the start, not really liking her mother and having these assumptions about her mother, that as the story moves forward and as she uncovers a lot of these kind of secrets and things about her origin and about Dr. Ballinger and about her mother, she kind of sees her mother in this different light and comes to appreciate her mother and understand her mother much more. And so again, I really like that dynamic between Josie and her mother, and then also Josie with Dr. Ballinger as this kind of father figure. And yeah, just seeing like those dynamics and how they progressed and changed throughout the story. So then we also have Kate, who is, I believe, girl 3. So she was the third girl who was born from these experiments. And Josie meets her along the way during this road trip, and Kate ends up joining her on this road trip to help her find her mother. And I thought Kate was a really fun character as well, because she's a bit of a, like, the foil to what Josie is. So while Josie kind of is in awe of Dr. Ballinger and wants to recreate his work and make him proud, Kate is very much the opposite. She kind of sees Dr. Ballinger as nothing. Like, she does not see him as a father figure, and she doesn't really care about him, and she hasn't really thought about him since he died. And we also see that whereas Josie wasn't really told anything about her life by her mother, Kate's mother was much more forthcoming with not only like Kate's past and what actually happened, but also in terms of like these powers. Josie has no idea that like she can have these powers, or that, you know, we see her as she's going along and like discovers that she has these powers and coming to terms with that. Whereas Kate is actually been using her powers and knows about them, and her mother is just much more forthcoming with all of this stuff. And so we see again like these different perspectives of the situation and how, you know, different people would deal with these situations. And so Kate is just this very strong-willed woman who kind of knows who she is and knows what she wants, whereas Josie is very much like trying to figure herself out and figure out her past and figure out everything that's happening. And so I just really like this kind of juxtaposition between Kate and Josie, and seeing the differences and then also the similarities, because they do come from like the same past and the same origin. And yeah, I just really like their dynamic. And then also, not to give any spoilers away, but there is a cute little, I don't know if I'll call it a love triangle, but there is some cute little like romantic moments and then a actual romance that happens, and Kate, Josie, and one other character are involved, and I definitely like the direction that things went. And maybe if I talk about spoilers a little later on, I'll go in more depth of like what actually this was, but I really liked it, and that's all I'll say about that. So then we have Isabelle, who is another one of the girls. I think she's girl 2, so the second girl who was born from these experiments, and she's another girl that Josie and the gang kind of meets on this road trip, and then she ends up joining them. And Isabelle was also a really interesting character because, again, we're seeing another one of these girls who have dealt with this whole situation in a very different way from Josie and from Kate. And so Isabelle her mother was very kind of strict and hard on her because her mother knew that these powers were possible. And so throughout Isabelle's life, as she's growing up, she's never shown signs of having any kind of powers. And so her mother is like kind of puts her in these like training situations and like is trying to kind of force this power out of her. And so for her whole life, Isabelle hasn't been able to. So because of this, Isabelle ends up coming across as this very kind of timid and kind of docile character because she is just kind of going on the whim of her mother and in a way trying to make her mother proud and prove that she does have powers and she is special. But not that her mother is doing this in a malicious way. I think she was doing this because she wanted the best for her kid and to like prove that she was actually special, that Isabelle actually ends up running away. So when Josie and Kate and this other character come to see her, Isabelle comes across as this way, but then we find out that she has ran away from her mother and decided to join the group and kind of help Josie finding her mother, but also kind of break away from her mother and what her own mother wanted from her. Then once she actually joins the group, we see her become much more comfortable with herself, and we actually see her learn about her own powers, and her powers are very, very different than Josie and Kate's. And we see kind of how she becomes much more like calculated and powerful, and kind of like through these powers and through this sisterhood of being with Kate and Josie, she again just feels like much more comfortable, much more powerful, and accepts who she is fully, whereas with Josie it's kind of taken her some time to figure out who she is and what these powers mean. Isabelle right away is like, yeah, this is who I am, this is what I want, and goes for it. I actually love the dynamic between all 3 of these girls and seeing how, again, like they all come from the same background, but how different they truly are and how different their desires and motivations and emotions are. And then the last character I want to talk about is Tom, and Tom is basically this reporter that Josie initially meets when she's starting her search for her mother. And this is a reporter who apparently her mother kind of sought out and was talking to before Josie finds out that her mother was missing. And so Tom decides right away that he's going to help Josie and to the bottom of where her mother went. He is also, for some reason that we find out later on, very invested in the homestead and in Dr. Ballinger and these experiments, and is kind of trying to write this book about the girls and their situation. And so he kind of has his own motivations of why he wants to help Josie, but at the same time I think he genuinely cares about Josie and he wants to help her and help her find her mother. So I just think Tom is a really interesting character, and I think his dynamic with the other girls, and as well as, like I said, this like little bit of a love triangle, I think all of that was just really great. And so overall I think these 4 characters were really cool, very different, very fascinating. And that's another thing that I really liked about this book, because these are like the 4 main characters, 3 of them being 3 of the girls, but we also actually along the way meet pretty much every other girl, and I just thought it was really interesting and fascinating to see how different each character was. And like I said a bunch of times now, you know, despite being like coming from the same situation, same origin, all of these girls and their mothers were just very different from each other. And then also seeing again how they're, despite having, you know, 100% DNA, each girl with their mother, but all of these characters had really different situations and different personalities and different motivations that we see throughout the book, and I just think it was really interesting to see all of that. And so lastly, talking about the themes, I've kind of touched on a lot of them already, so I'll just quickly go over the ones that I really liked. But number one was definitely this kind of mother-daughter relationship. So we definitely see that with Josie and her mother, but I think in a little ways we see with every single girl and their mother pairing, we see the different dynamics and the different situations that mothers and daughters go through. The biggest thing that I think was really cool was seeing how, like I said before, you know, Josie doesn't really like her mother, doesn't really connect with her, understand her at the beginning of the book. But then as we go along and Josie kind of uncovers all of these secrets about her mother and about this whole situation, really sees her mother in a different light, and she comes to appreciate her mother more. And I was actually watching this interview with the author where she talks about kind of her inspiration behind the book and about this mother-daughter relationship came from the fact of a lot of times, especially like in the past, mothers are really just seen as this kind of vessel in a way. It's just a space for a child to grow, and you know, the uterus is just there for a child to grow in, but the mother doesn't really have like a huge influence, and the father is seen as the one who is going to give the child like the humanity and imbue it with soul. So obviously I think that was a bit more of a idea from the past, but I do think that it definitely shows up in society today. And you know, not that fathers aren't important, and I definitely don't think that that's what this book is saying, but I think it's definitely showing the bond that mothers have with their children, and the responsibilities that mothers have, which fathers don't necessarily have, because a lot of times, you know, mothers are the ones who are going to be the primary caregivers. They're going to be the ones who are nurturing their children and are there for their children throughout their lives, and they're also going to be the ones who are going to have to make kind of the hard decisions. They're the ones who are going to have to say no, and you know, be the ones who are going to put their foot down for their child's safety. And again, not that fathers don't do that, but fathers are usually the ones who are seen as this more like fun-loving and easygoing, and just this wild connection they have with their children, which just comes and goes in a way. Basically, I think that this book does a really good job of talking about this responsibility, as well as situation that mothers are in, and how they don't necessarily get the appreciation they are due. Obviously, we all give our mothers a shout out on Mother's Day and things like that, and like realize all of the sacrifices they make and everything. But I mean, that mother role is just so much more than that. And I think with Josie and her situation, we really see how easy it is for children to see their mothers in a certain light and kind of grapple with that, and like, especially, you know, when you're younger, kind of push their mothers away. But then as you get older and you kind of see things from a different perspective, which really just comes with like maturity and experience, you see your mother in a different light, and you appreciate her for all that she has done. And I don't know if this is making sense, but I think that this book does a really good job of talking about that mother-daughter relationship. So another huge theme I think was in the book was basically like women's agency over their own bodies. And this definitely comes out in the concept of parthenogenesis, which is basically the like scientific term for this idea of birthing a child with like 100% of the female's DNA. I think it's like also known as like virgin births, something like that. But basically this concept allows through the, like, I think the book through this concept allows this discussion to come up about like rights over women's bodies, because we see, especially in this book, like Dr. Ballinger, who's a scientist, is the one who sort of makes it possible for these women to have children with just their DNA. But because of like his involvement, he kind of sees himself as having ownership over these women's bodies and their children. And so we really see kind of how different groups in society believe this, and believe like that men hold this power over women, despite the fact that, like, you know, these children were 100% just from their mothers. There's no men involved. And yet in this book, in the society in this book, but also I think like society in real life also, but how men see themselves as still holding power and control over women and their bodies and, you know, these children. You know, in the book, like I said before, there are a lot of these like religious groups and groups of people who kind of see these children as in like not human or not normal, because they don't have any male DNA. And because of that, there's actually especially a specific situation that happens in this book where we see that because of that, because they see women as these things, you know, not real people, like these 9 girls in the book, they treat them in a very like disgusting and horrible way, but it's because they think that they have ownership over them. They are trying to control them. And obviously, you know, in our real world, that kind of happens obviously with having male DNA in our systems. So I don't know, I just think like that was a really interesting take on this kind of conversation. And then I will mention that although this book definitely is like big on feminism and those like feminism conversations, in no way is this book like man-hating or anything. I don't want to give that off that impression. It actually is a really great moment and situation where the author talks about how a father is important, and a loving relationship between a man and a woman can create a child in this like loving, beautiful way. So in no way is she trying to say that like men shouldn't exist or we don't need men or anything. I think it's more about talking about how the position that society has given men and whether or not that's valid. And I think, well, we know the answer that this book is trying to say is that no, you know, that position is not valid and we shouldn't give that much power to men. But I think again that this book does like talks about that in a really interesting and fascinating and unique way. And so lastly, I'm gonna get into a bit of a spoilery section now, because I just want to talk about like a couple things as well as a couple like wishes and things that I might have wanted more of in the book. So I will put spoilers up if you haven't read this. But basically, number one, so there's this big reveal, and that is that Tom is actually Dr. Ballinger's son, Junior. And there's a moment in the book where like the girls think that the Ballinger sons are the ones who are after them, and then we find out that actually Tom is with them all along, so he's not necessarily a bad guy. And so basically, because of this betrayal and lie that Tom, you know, tells the girls, they decide to kind of leave him. They don't really let him like join them for the rest of the trip to like find Josie's mother. And while I think that is fair, like he did lie to them, I would have liked to see Tom meet his father and kind of confront his father, because in a way I think Tom's relationship with his own father, because Dr. Ballinger was never really there for his own family because he was always at the homestead and with these girls. And so Tom has this really kind of like Josie has this warped sense of his own father, because while he does see him as his father and he does love him like his father, he's also kind of been abandoned by his father for these other children. I would have liked to see kind of this confrontation that I think would have been really therapeutic for Tom. I also thought it was really interesting about how Josie's mother was the one who kind of started this idea of the Parthenogenesis and having children without male DNA. And I kind of would have liked, like we got a glimpse of kind of how she got into this and her researching all of this and then finding Dr. Ballinger, but I kind of would have liked to see her kind of see more of that past and see why she came to decide those things, and like maybe there was something going on where she pushed her towards wanting this and like being interested in this stuff. So I feel like I would have liked to see more of that past and what actually happened there. And then lastly, I would have actually really liked to see all of the girls coming together, or at least the ones who are remaining, coming together and forming more of a sisterhood, because while I think it was so great seeing Isabelle, Kate, and Josie, and then in the end Fiona kind of joined the group, there's still 4 other remaining girls who Josie meets along the way, but for like kind of different reasons don't join her. And while all of those are valid, I think I just would have liked to see more of like just having them all come together and be there for each other, and realizing that this bond that they have is really important, and what power it can bring them when they really all come together. And this is supposedly a standalone, but if it ever gets a sequel, I think that would be really cool to just have a moment where all of the girls are together. So those are basically all of my thoughts on this book. I had kind of zero expectations going into this book. I haven't heard many people talking about it, and I just think it threw me off. I think this book was so good. It was so interesting. It had so many great themes and conversations, and like I've said, it had really great characters and a really cool plot and really good writing. And if you haven't read this, you definitely should. I think if you're into like sci-fi, fantasy, superhero stuff, thrillers, anything like that, you'll definitely find something you like in this book. Thanks guys for watching, and I will see you next time.